right, why don't we get started? Good morning, everyone, though everybody's in a different time zone, I think. I think one of our presenters is on the West Coast and one of our presenters is in Europe, so we're all over the place. So good morning to those of you who are this morning. My name is Kirsty Pecci. I'm the director of the Zero Waste Project at Conservation Law Foundation. And we're here today to talk about broken promises, how the big beverage corporations have failed to keep their recycling promises, and also what we can do about that and moving forward, what works. And that's really about deposit return systems. So we're going to start off this morning with me giving you a very, very brief background, and then we're going to roll right in to hear Nisha Urbancic. Nisha, let me know if I'm saying your name incorrectly. From Changing Markets. She's the campaign director at Changing Markets. And then after that, we'll hear from Susan Collins, the president of Container Recycling Institute. And then finally, we'll have some time for question and answers. Just so everybody is aware, everything here is being recorded. We will be sharing this out. We'll be sharing the slides out. So be aware of that. And please, as you go, put questions in the chat. We'll be keeping track of those, and we will try and answer as many of them as we can at the end of the presentations. So why are we here today? What are we talking about? First of all, let me just tell you who we are. Conservation Law Foundation is a New England-based organization, and we use the law, science, and market to create solutions that preserve our natural resources, build healthy communities, sustain a vibrant economy, and most important to me, protect human health. We have been operating since about the mid-1960s. We're a nonprofit, and I started the Zero Waste program about 5 years ago now at Conservation Law Foundation. And we are working on these issues because we know how important they are to protecting our most vulnerable communities, environmental justice communities, because we know how important these solutions are for climate, and of course, directly because of the plastic problem and other human health problems and negative impacts that our waste system creates. What we're seeing right now in the deposit return world, or the bottle bill world, is that there's been a sea change. People are more focused on plastics, and we've seen the information coming out of the industry, out of Coke, Pepsi, Nestle, the other big companies that have created a lot of this plastic pollution. They're talking now about being okay with deposit return systems. Traditionally, the last 30 years, they've fought any expansion or new deposit return systems in the United States tooth and nail. They spent in Massachusetts something like $10 million with other allies to defeat a ballot initiative that would expand the deposit return system, the bottle bill in Massachusetts. But now they're backing off on that. What we are seeing, though, are two different tacks that folks should be aware of, just to set the table. The first is that while they are not openly opposing deposit return systems, the beverage industry did show up in Massachusetts for the extended producer responsibility hearing earlier this year. Extended producer responsibility, the bills that we're talking about for packaging and paper in the United States right now, are really reimbursement data bills, and then sometimes they go a bit further. There are some bills that are going further than that, but they're not about bottles and cans. And the reason for that is while deposit return systems or bottle bills are part or type of producer responsibility system, the key ingredient that makes a deposit return system work really, really well is that return fee, that deposit fee, 5 cents or sometimes 10 cents in the United States. And that drives people to bring those bottles and cans back. And that's why we see 90, 95% redemption sometimes for systems that are included bottles and cans and a deposit return fee, as we're talking about. The beverage industry has been pushing for the idea that as these new systems for extended producer responsibility for packaging are established, bottle return systems should be folded into them so that they can save money, so that they don't see those same high returns. They just won't work as well. And so that's something that we're seeing the beverage industry really pushing for. That is a terrible idea. And I think people should be aware of that that's something we're seeing at hearings, in testimony, et cetera. And it doesn't work, and it's a bad idea. And we can get into that more if people have questions about that. The other thing that we're seeing is while the beverage industry did not testify, nor did they, as far as I can tell, submit written testimony in the Massachusetts hearing, for instance, opposing the expansion of the bottle bill in Massachusetts. They did not show. They were a total no-show. They did not support it, first of all. That's very important. They could have showed up and said, this is a great idea, which it is, to expand the bottle bill in Massachusetts. They did not do that. But what they did in Connecticut, and I suspect they're doing in Massachusetts, was work behind the scenes to tell legislators that the beverage industry should be in charge of deposit return systems. And unfortunately, in Connecticut, we saw an 11th hour amendment to the expansion of the bottle bill in Connecticut. The expansion of the bottle bill set a target, which is a fantastic thing, a redemption target. It expanded the number of containers included, and it went to 10 cents in a few years. All good things. Unfortunately, the law also handed the control of the system over to the beverage industry. We know that when the beverage industry is in charge, they gut the systems, they weaken the bills, and unfortunately, it results in a lack of recycling, a lack of all the stuff that the deposit return system can bring us: litter cleanup, good recycling, and saving communities money. So all of those pieces are lacking if the beverage industry is in charge. So I just wanted to make sure you knew that background and why we're having this conversation, because we're very concerned that instead of having a good, healthy expansion of the systems that are in place, the deposit return systems that are in place, or new deposit return systems, either at the federal level or in other states, what we will see instead are weakened systems that are an adjunct to, inappropriately to, an APR system, or systems that are controlled by the beverage industry. So with that, I would like to pass it over to two experts. The first is Nisha, or Bancic, as I said. Oh, and here's my email address on the screen. Feel free to contact me if you have questions in the future. We've done a lot of writing on this. And then, as I said, please, if you get in touch with me, you need to, that's fine. We'll move forward and we'll have questions at the end. But first, let's hear from Nisha, or Bancic, from Changing Markets. And welcome, and thank you very much for making the time for us today, Nisha.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon. I'm based in London, and it's quite late and cold here, but yeah, it's really nice to be here and to be able to speak about our work. So I'm going to present our report, Talking Trash, where we basically investigated how plastic polluters, plastic producers are basically undermining the solutions to the plastic crisis. This is how the report looks like. It's really thick, and we spent around a year working on it. Just this presentation, I'll start with the problem of plastic, and then, or plastic pollution, I should say, and then looking at the flurry of voluntary initiatives, the tactics that the industry is using, and how these tactics work out in practice. In the report, we also looked at some of the solutions like bioplastic, chemical recycling, reuse, etc. So, feel free to look at it if you have time. It's really thick. Next slide. So yeah, I guess kind of like our starting point was that so much attention has been going to the problem of plastic pollution. As you can see here, it's been on the covers of a lot of newspapers, TV shows, documentaries. And consistently, when people get asked how they feel about plastic, they always say 80–90% of people want legislation, and they want a solution to the plastic crisis. Next slide. Yet, despite all this attention, we're nowhere near solving this crisis. The production is expected to double again by 2030. Half of the plastic that was ever made was produced since 2005, and it's still ending up in nature at a rate of 8 million tons a year, which is one garbage truck per minute. And COVID-19 health crisis actually made this worse. So in our research and our investigation, we wanted to investigate why is this the case. Next slide. And our report is basically a global investigation. We looked at 15 countries across 5 continents. We looked at the 10 biggest fast-moving consumer goods companies, and we looked at more than 50 voluntary initiatives and commitments, some of them at the national level, some of them international. here you can see the countries. So we investigated United States, Bolivia, Uruguay, Kenya, China, Japan, European Union and legislation at the EU level as such, but also Spain, France, Austria, Czech Republic, and Scotland. And all these countries, what they had in common, in moving to the next slide, is that, yeah, this kind of companies operate across all these countries. And there's like, what our report showed is that there is big failure of voluntary initiatives. It also revealed there's very intense lobby to derail legislation, and also that industry applies similar tactics around the world in every country that we looked at. Next slide. So we looked at those tactics and we kind of grouped them into delay, derail, and distract and derail. So 3 Ds, so it's easy to remember. And basically, yeah, I'll talk about them more in detail throughout the report. I'll go into example, but moving on to the next slide. I don't know if I have to tell you about Keep America Beautiful, but this is really important because this is kind of what set the narrative around the plastic crisis. So basically, Keep America Beautiful was founded in the 1950s in the US, and it was founded by the beverage and packaging industry. And basically, it wasn't really advertised that they were behind this initiative, but they had enormous advertising budget and they were putting out ads like this one. And the main thing was that it's not the companies that are responsible for the plastic crisis by producing all this plastic, but it's the consumers, it's the litter bugs basically that throw the waste and don't know how to, later this changed into how they don't know properly how to recycle the plastic. But basically, yeah, this has been the main narrative since the 1950s. And with this, the industry has very successfully succeeded in delaying legislation and yeah, making the main focus on littering and on the behavior of consumers. Next slide. We kind of tried to put some of these tactics into this kind of comic illustration. So basically, yeah, the main tactic that the industry had was not so much denying the problem, because the problem of plastic is very visible. It's not like climate change when, you know, CO2 emissions are very kind of invisible around it, but plastic waste is actually very, very, yeah, very obvious. So basically they try to yeah, shift the blame on the consumer and not on the producer of all this plastic. Next slide. So basically for a very long time, it was the people that were responsible for the pollution, but this started changing recently. And I think a lot of this kind of goes to the good work of the Break Free from Plastic movement, which is a coalition of lots of NGOs. And they started making what they call the Brand Audit. So it's a group of volunteers around the world that basically pick up the waste and they kind of weigh it every year, and they kind of try to establish who it belongs to. So here you can see the latest Brand Audit from 2021, and the #1 plastic polluter is always Coca-Cola. They always come up with the most plastic waste found in across the world, followed by PepsiCo, Unilever, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Mondelez. So you can see it's more or less always the same companies that come up as responsible for this pollution. Next slide. So what we did, we basically looked at the voluntary initiatives of this plastic polluters, and we looked also at how much plastic they're producing. And this is really something they have only started to reveal in 2018. Here you can see how their plastic footprint has changed from 2019 to 2020. You can click again. I have some animations on the slides. So basically what we've seen that although these companies have had commitments, ambition, targets for decades, actually their plastic footprint is not really changing. They're more or less at the same level. Coca-Cola and Mars actually increased, and Coca-Cola increased by 80,000 million tons, which is twice the amount of Perfetti Van Melle, which is the number 10 plastic polluter at the time when we looked at them. Next slide, please. And this is the latest. So as I said, they only started, so this was one of the tactics as well, that these companies, they didn't even reveal what their plastic footprint was. Some of them still don't reveal, like Procter & Gamble and Perfetti Van Melle, we still don't know exactly how much plastic they're producing. But you can also see that it hasn't changed much over the last 4 years. It's been fairly constant. Next slide. So how does this look like? So Coca-Cola, they produce 2.9 million tons a year, which is nearly 9 times the weight of the Empire State Building. Next slide. PepsiCo, 2.3 million tons a year, which is 3 times the weight of the Golden Gate Bridge. So every year, these companies pump out so much plastic. Next slide. And basically what I said before, they have been very committed. They have been putting out a flurry of voluntary commitments and initiatives. And we looked at some of them. Next slide. So here is the overview of their commitments. So we looked at whether or not they're supporting legislation, and especially legislation on mandatory collection, so the bottle bills and deposit return systems. We looked at whether or not they have their own targets for recycled content, for collection. And also here you see the green one where we looked at whether or not they report their plastic footprint. But as you can see, yeah, a lot of these companies have been having commitments for a really long time. They're not that ambitious, but they're very, very often heavily marketed, and they always get really nice headlines. Next slide. Coca-Cola is especially interesting because they've been making their commitments already for 30 years. Next slide. And these commitments, I know this is really small, we'll zoom in, but we analyzed all their commitments over the 30 years, and we looked at recycled content, we looked at bio-based plastic, we looked at recyclability, we looked at recovery and collection. And we've discovered that in those 30 years, they haven't met one of their commitments. It's always been shifting goalposts. So for example, you see that in 1990, they promised 25% recycled content, and still right now they're only at 10%. So next slide, please. And this is the story we got in the Financial Times. Click again, please. And Coca-Cola actually admitted, so they said, you know, that in 1991, they had their first goal for recycled content, and now they have another goal. But they haven't met it. But, you know, I just want to do a little reality check. So going on the next slide. So this is the reality check. You know, the blue line is actually from 1990 to 2019, how much the single-use PET bottle has increased. So we went from 685 millions to 1.3 trillion beverage containers every year. And the share of PET has increased from 17 to 42%. This is really huge. And this company is also like, this is an interesting report also from Break Free from Plastic. They looked at the project that these companies are involved in, and they realized that 85% of projects that they're funding as part of their voluntary commitments, of course, are actually not, you know, real solutions. They're basically, they're basically unproven at scale technologies like chemical recycling. A lot of these projects are just announced and then nothing ever happens. A lot of them are also about cleanups. So just cleaning up the beaches and kind of paying someone else to dispose and then claiming that you're plastic neutral. Next slide. And they also broke this down basically on how they perform per company. Click again, please. So you can see that Procter & Gamble and Mondelez are amongst the worst offenders when it comes to the full solution projects. Next slide. So this is what we've also seen, like that was one of the tactics that the industry has also sold us recycling as something that, you know, is supposed to work, but only 9% of plastic ever produced was recycled. And in most, in the US, this is still happening mostly with the public money and not with the money that is paid by producers. Next slide. The latest trend is chemical recycling. So we did a nice video explainer on chemical recycling, and we also looked at chemical recycling. There's a lot of studies out there saying that it's really not proven, but there's an interesting example, which is the Loop Industries. Loop Industries had partnership with Coca-Cola, Danone, PepsiCo, and L'Oreal, and their whole idea was recycling PET bottles back into PET, which is actually one of the few, let's say, ways that recycling already really works very well. So we have mechanical recycling of PET bottles back into PET bottles that works really well if they're collected through deposit return systems. But because we know that a lot of these companies oppose deposit return systems, it's better for them to basically have partnerships with this magical silver bullet solution kind of technology providers that don't really have anything behind them. So Loop was exposed as like smoke and mirror show by this company Hindenburg Research, and following that their shares fell by 39%, and they're also subject to 2 class lawsuits. Next slide. Another tactic that we've discovered is really this endless piloting. So in New Plastics Economy, we've discovered that businesses are doing a lot of reuse trials, but only 1.9% of their plastic was reusable packaging in 2019, and now it's still the same. It's very similar. And we've also discovered that most of their commitments are kind of on recycled content and recyclability and compostability, which means that after they kind of put the plastic out, they're no longer responsible for what happens to it. There's no support for separate collection, which is actually really important because that prevents littering and enables this reuse and recycling programs. Next slide. So we looked at, as I said before, their own commitments, and I provided an overview of that. But then another really important tactic was also this independent organizations that are set up to basically solve the plastic waste problem. And very often they're focusing on end of pipe solutions, such as cleanups, such as recycling, but very rarely they're basically focused on reducing plastic or supporting progressive legislation. Next slide. So we analyzed some of these group initiatives that were set up by the industry. Alliance to End Plastic Waste is an interesting one because here the industry committed $1.5 billion to address plastic waste. And since we published our report, there have been several exposés by Reuters looking at how this, basically looking at how several projects that the Alliance set up in India, the Renew Oceans, have actually failed. They're not doing anything, but they're still on the websites of these companies as, you know, great things that they're doing to save the world from plastic waste. Another interesting one is the New Plastics Economy by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which looks great on paper, but this is kind of the reason why all these companies are putting out these commitments on recyclability, compostability, and reusability. And this can be kind of, it's really up to them what they want to use. And very often they're claiming certain things are as recyclable when in reality, or compostable when in reality they are not. And as I've shown you before, they're also increasing their plastic footprint, or that plastic footprint is staying relatively constant. Next slide. What we've also found, like we looked at the companies and their membership, and we looked at, you know, it's kind of like two-faced thing. So on the one hand, they're all members of this really nice sounding fake environmental groups, like the Recycling Partnership, New Plastic Economy, Alliance to End Plastic Waste, Ocean Conservancy. But on the other hand, they're also members in the industry associations that have been found to be lobbying against legislation. So Coca-Cola, we saw they're members of 7 initiatives to address plastic waste and 10 initiatives that undermine legislation. If you click again, so these are the ones that we found. So for example, American Chemistry Council, you see the orange ones are in the US, the yellow ones are international, and the blue ones are the ones in Europe. So we kind of found that these companies have become more smart. They don't want to damage their brand by lobbying directly against legislation. So they're actually members of these groups, industry associations that go out there and lobby against laws that they don't like. But, you know, their public face is all about, you know, we're doing our best. We're really, you know, we're members of Al MacArthur Foundation, New Plastics Economy. We're members of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. So this is what they also use when they go to public hearings or when they talk to the legislators. And legislators often take this kind of membership or this kind of, you know, voluntary efforts at face value, and they don't really investigate what's behind and what these groups are actually achieving. And also how, you know, on the other hand, they're members of the different groups that undermine legislation. Next slide. So one of the big group of tactics that we looked at are this delaying tactics. So we've seen all kinds. So one of them, for example, is this voluntary initiatives. Then other ones that we have seen were also basically that, that they don't disclose information. So we have very little data about plastic footprint of different organizations. We have very little data about collection and recycling rates in different jurisdictions. And this really benefits the industry, like not giving this data benefits them because they can hide behind the lack of information, or they can say this is not necessary because we're already doing our bit. And yeah, if we go to the next slide. We've also seen that even when legislation has been adopted, the industry likes to set itself up to be in control. What Kirsty mentioned earlier on the EPR organizations, like we have in Europe, we have had EPR now already for a really long time, like I think more than a decade. And what we've seen is that there are different ways of doing EPR, and of course it has achieved, let's say, higher recycling rates than in countries that don't have anything in place. But I think it's around 60%, whereas if you have DRS, collection and recycling is over 90%. And these organizations, so ARA, EcoEmbes, and EcoCom, these are EPR monopolies that have been set up in Austria, Spain, and Czech Republic. And these monopoly organizations are in fact owned by the plastic industry. So their shareholders are supermarkets, consumer brands, and plastic producers. And this is very little known to the public, because the public sees this organization as recycling organizations, as organizations that were set up by law, and they also have, by law, they're obliged to promote recycling and waste management. So they have huge budgets and really big impact influence in the media because of their advertising power. And what we've seen in those countries, sorry, please go back still, is the lack of transparency. DRS stands for bottle bills, deposit return system. That's what we have in Europe. We have really big lack of transparency in those countries. We don't know, because it's the industry that owns the data. We don't know what the collection rates are. In Spain, for example, EcoEmbes claims that they collect and recycle 70% of the plastic. But the first independent study that was done by the regional government of Balearic Islands discovered that this was only 25%. And then you can have this fight, you know, the word of EcoEmbes against the word of a regional government. There's also been very little achievement in terms of reduction of plastic, because the focus has been on lightweighting, because companies had to pay a certain fee per ton of plastic that they placed on the market. And because of that, there's also been very little move towards recyclability and better recycling, because it was just about the weight, and lightweighting actually undermines recycling in many respects. These organizations, as I said before, they emerge as the biggest opponents to legislative reforms, because now in Europe we have obligation to collect 90% of plastic bottles by 2029. And this is only possible to do through bottle bills or deposit return systems. And basically, yeah, this is, these organizations are really lobbying against this kind of introduction of a better legislation. Next slide. So this is an interesting example of Ecoembes. So Ecoembes is a monopoly in Spain, and you can see the majority of their money is kind of comes from Green Dot. Green Dot is the licensing fee that producers have to pay when they put their plastic packaging on the market, and this is paid by weight. This is why there is this idea, you know, if you reduce the weight, you pay less. So 90% of money of Ecoembes comes from that, and 10% comes from recycling. And you can see how the money has increased. So, and this is kind of also the irony, right? Because the more, like we call this investigation, more trash, more cash, right? Because the more plastic is put on the market, the more money Ecoembes gets, because it's paid by weight. And we've also seen that it's very tightly controlled by the industry. On board of directors, you have big supermarkets, you have Procter & Gamble, you have Danone, you have Unilever, Coca-Cola. And Ecoembes has become the biggest lobby against deposit return systems, while Coca-Cola, Danone, and others claim that they're supportive. Ecoembes was doing the dirty lobbying work and fighting this system in the media. So again, this is DRS is the way we say in Europe for the bottle bill. Next slide. So this is the investigation that was done about this Green Dot organizations, or this EPR organizations that were actually set up by the industry and controlled by the industry. And this is really a big danger right now, because this is what's being exported around the world. Like on the right, you see Clean Up Kenya, the Kenyan organization that we work with as well. And they wrote this article, how extended producer responsibility law in Kenya that doesn't include deposit system, so the bottle bill is not part of it, but it also sets up a monopoly, similar to what we've seen in Europe and similar to what has failed in Europe. Next slide. And yeah, then the industry tactic is also like, once, you know, legislation has been adopted and it has been kind of on the books, that they try to weaken the implementation further. And that's something that has been happening with the things I mentioned before, with this EPR schemes trying to undermine the implementation at the national level of bottle bills. Next slide. And yeah, now brings me just to this issue. Why do we want bottle bills? So here is basically average EU plastic collection rates in 9 countries that already have bottle bill deposit return system. And you can see these countries are Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Lithuania, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And their collection rates are 90%, over 90%. And in the countries in Europe that don't have, so that only have EPR systems that I talked about before, because all countries in Europe already have EPR that includes bottles, it's under 60%. And this is now the fight. Is the industry going to win the fact that, you know, we don't need bottle bills or deposit systems to get to 90%? Next slide. We have a great example from Lithuania, which in 1 year managed to cut the waste from bottles and cans by 87% after it introduced the bottle bill. So Reloop, they actually calculated how much waste this means per person per capita per year. And it went from 113 in 2015 to just 14 in 2017. Next slide. And this is an interesting example. Like, this is basically what the industry has been fighting to derail. So you see on the left, we have, so this graph shows how much how much beverage containers are wasted per capita by country, and year is 2017. And you can see what kind of policies they have. So in green, you have deposit countries. So the country that has deposit return system or bottle bill and more than 25% market share of refillables. So these are the countries like Germany, Croatia, the Netherlands that have very, very little waste. And then next ones are just the countries that have deposit, but don't have such a strong refillable market share. So these are the blue countries. And then on the other end of the scale, you see non-deposit countries that have, that don't have any refillables. And you can see that they waste up to 200 beverage containers per person per year. Next slide. So this is what I wanted to conclude with. It's actually voluntary commitments. They don't work because there's a big problem with accountability, because companies can make and break them. And they don't do a lot, like as we have seen from the earlier graphs. Next slide. And we have proven solutions. These are legislations for like bottle bills, reuse refill targets and policies, recycled content obligations, and also I think we need to ban certain problematic types of plastic like PVC, and also certain products like soft plastic is really problematic because it can't get recycled. And then really interesting thing that is supported by Break Free from Plastic, and examples exist across the world, especially in Asia, but also in Europe. We have zero waste cities, so cities that actually put in place policies to prevent waste. Next slide. So yeah, that was my presentation. I think I spent my time, but yeah, really happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
Nisha, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Great job. Really interesting report. We'll put the link in the chat so people can get hold of the report as soon as possible. Also, we will get to some questions from Nisha at the end. So hold your questions. Thank you for putting some in the chat. Next, we have another outstanding presenter, Susan V. Collins, the president of the Container Recycling Institute. Susan, please take it away.
Thank you, Kirsty. And I want to say thank you to CLF for hosting this webinar. And thank you to Nisha and Changing Markets Foundation for preparing such an amazing, excellent, and comprehensive report that it really pulls all of the information together in one place. And that was a great presentation. So I'm going to now cover a lot of the same material, the themes anyway, that Nisha covered, but bringing it to the US context and giving US examples of these same tactics. So in the next slide, what we're talking about here, I'm going to focus on really on the beverage container deposit programs, DRS or bottle bills. I call them the rock stars of recycling. They really work. They reduce litter by 50%, and they achieve very, very high recycling rates, unlike any other kind of recycling program I've ever seen. This slide shows the recycling rates in the United States of deposit containers versus non-deposit containers. And you can see that the recycling rates for some material types are even 4 times as much if a container has a deposit on it versus if it doesn't. So this is what works. And the beverage industry has been proposing an alternative solution that is a very, very weak solution for like 4 decades. And so everybody who knows this subject well knows that container deposit programs work and the alternative doesn't work. And yet the alternative keeps being portrayed as something that does work. Next slide. So this slide shows the recycled PET content in bottles that we've been tracking for a couple of decades. The source of this is NAPCOR, the National Association for PET Container Resources. And Nisha talked about some of the recycled content goals that have been set out by companies going all the way back to 1991. But none of those goals have ever been met. It's only in the past couple of years that, really just the last year, that the recycled content amount in PET bottles has broken 10%. So that means that still pretty close to 90% of all of the content in PET bottles is virgin plastic. Next slide. So this is what the recycling rate looks like in the United States. The top line, the green line, is the collection rate, the amount of bottles and PET bottles collected. But there's a tremendous amount of both contamination and non-usable material in those bales, including things like green plastic, for which there is no market in most places, and the full shrink sleeve labels, and a lot of other materials that are unusable. So the bottom line, the orange, is what they call the rPET generation right now. It's the amount of material that's actually able to be used in a new product. And you can see it's hovering at around 20%. So again, that means, 4 out of every 5 PET bottles in the United States are not being recycled. And that's even with the help of the fact that we have 10 bottle bill states in the United States. So it's really the 10 bottle bill states that are making this rate as high as it is, and it's still pretty terrible, hovering at around 20%. So the next slide, I'm going to talk about what works, just to emphasize this point. There's 2 slides I've got on what works. One is to have a container deposit law with a high enough deposit value. The deposit value really matters. The deposit itself is a very strong incentive, and it stands to reason, and it plays out in real life, that if you have a higher deposit, you will have a higher return rate. A stronger incentive leads to stronger behavior change. So the places that have a deposit value of 10 cents instead of 5 cents, the ones in orange on this slide, they have the highest return rates in the country. The next slide is what works, number 2. So the other thing that works is to, it's common sense, is to include all the beverage types in the program. If you have a program that only covers half of the beverage types, you're only going to get really strong recycling rates for half of the beverages. And we've got that situation in a couple of states. So I'll point your attention over to the right to Massachusetts, which only covers 42% of the beverages that are sold in that state. So of course they're going to have a low recycling rate overall. So the next slide is the combination of these two. This is how many beverage units actually get captured by the deposit program. So if you don't cover the full scope of beverages, you're not going to capture as many containers. And if you don't have a high deposit value of at least 10 cents, you're also not going to capture very many containers. So the combination of those two in Massachusetts gives it an actual capture rate in that program of only 21%. So remember these 2 things, because these are the exact 2 things that the beverage industry keeps lobbying about. And I'll show you examples of that. That, the 2 things that we know that really work well, that's what they lobby and say that they don't want to see in the legislation. So next slide. So this is the 10 states. I know this is a busy slide, but focus on the X's, the white areas that have X's. This is where these are the programs that don't have the coverage in those areas, and that's why they have low redemption rates. The beverage industry and their allies have not only blocked new deposit laws in new states, but they've also blocked updates in existing states, and that is dragging down the national recycling rate for beverage containers. Next slide. But they've even gone farther than this. Again, the beverage industry and their allies have supported repeal bills in most of the states that have deposits. So I just put this together yesterday. I didn't realize how hard we had worked over the years fighting back 23 repeal bills, and I don't even think I captured all of them. So this has been a constant battle just to retain the recycling programs that we do have in the country that work well. Next slide. So one of the tactics that they use in the United States is to put together websites and campaigns to oppose deposit laws that look like they're grassroots, but they're really not. I'll show a couple of examples from New York and Connecticut, and also there was a whole campaign in Massachusetts to vote no on question 2, and that was a $9 or $10 million effort a series of ads to keep that state from expanding its deposit law. So on the next slide, you can see the Connecticut and New York opposition to bottle bill expansions. These are websites that are put up that mostly look like they're grassroots websites. They've got a section on there to talk about how terrible they think container deposits are. They've got a section to capture people's email addresses so that they can send them more information. And in little tiny type at the very bottom, it says supported by the American Beverage Association on both of these two sites. Next slide. So in the chat, somebody asked a question about the American Beverage. They're now called American Beverage, not American Beverage Association. Somebody had asked about every bottle back. So I think I'm going to cover that in a couple of slides. Can we go back one slide? Because I think we might have missed one. Nope. Okay, go ahead and go forward one slide. In Connecticut, the testimony was in opposition to 1037. And remember, I said there were two things that make these programs work. One is to have a high enough deposit value, and the other is to expand to cover all the beverage types. And that's exactly what the American Beverage Association lobbied against. They wanted to recover all of the unclaimed deposits, which is tens of millions of dollars that they wanted to recapture out of that program that was being kept by the government. They wanted to delay expansion to new beverage types until 2026 or later. And they didn't want to increase the deposit to 10 cents. They also wanted to eliminate handling fees, which is a major cost in the program. And there was no mention of the litter value of having this program. Next slide. So again, this is just earlier this year. Both of these examples from Vermont and Connecticut are from 2021. So this is really current information. The same theme: lobbied against going to 10 cents in Vermont, lobbied against expanding to new beverage types, and lobbied in favor of reclaiming the deposits that the state is keeping and instead have those unclaimed deposits go to the beverage industry. They want that money. And they said in their statement that many of these containers are already being recycled. We know that's not true. And in Vermont, it was a startling realization that there were 18,000 tons of glass that actually went illegally to a closed landfill, and that was uncovered through the course of working on this bill in Vermont earlier this year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're getting into every bottle back territory. And I went through some of my older records and looked at the previous efforts that looked a lot like every bottle back. And that's why I entitled this Reinventing Programs and Recycling Press Releases, because it turns out that every bottle back is really just the same program that they've been doing year after year for a couple of decades. They just keep sort of renaming it. But the essence of the program is the same: to reach out to cities that need recycling bins and to provide grant money to get those cities bins, but to do so at such a rate that it doesn't even really affect 1 or 2% of the population of the United States. So it's really a tiny, tiny change that isn't going to make a big difference. Instead, if we had a national container deposit law, we would literally be able to triple our recycling rates for beverage containers and do so at a really high quality level. So the names of these, model cities: Recycle Together, Reimagine Machines, Pepsi's Dream Machines, Recycle Banks, Recycle and Win. You can just see that it's the same thing over and over that's just been rebranded every time. And there have been academic studies looking at this that show that corporate social responsibility is really a marketing tool. And I had one consultant that I talked to about who was working on one of these bin grant programs who said to me, I'm not stupid. I know that my consulting fees are being paid for out of their marketing budget. Next slide, please. So the American Beverage Every Bottle Back campaign is now 2 years old, but even on the very first day that it was launched, Plastics News did an analysis of the program and found that using the statistics that were provided by American Beverage, that if their program was 100% successful and did exactly what they wanted it to do, it would only raise the PET recycling rate by 1.3 percentage points, which is within the rate of variability that it goes up and down every year. It's almost an increase that you wouldn't even necessarily be able to attribute to this program because it's within sort of the range of error of the program, of the recycling rate every year. So they expected to be spending about $10 million every year. And 2 years in, I was able to see evidence of spending of about $10 million on giving out grants to cities for recycling bins, and at least $6 million spent on advertising. We know that there was a Super Bowl ad, and that's estimated to have cost $5.6 million. And then there was this huge ad purchase of an advertorial in National Geographic a couple months ago. They've also had earned media in The Hill, Real Clear Energy, and many local newspapers. And the result so far is only 6.6 million pounds of new recycling of PET, which is about 8% of their 10-year target. So at the very best, and that's 8% over 2 years, which means 4% per year. So at their very best, they'll only not even get to half of what they expect to get to if they roll out this program like they're doing for the rest of the 10-year period of time. And there's a lawsuit challenging the environmental claim that the bottles are 100% recyclable. And I'll show you that in a couple of slides. Next slide. This is just a quick screenshot of their Super Bowl ad. I don't know if we have time to play it or not. Can we, will it work if you click the button and play it?
See if it'll work, try, and then we'll see. Sometimes, oh, it's working. I'm not getting sound. Is anybody else?
That's okay, because I've got all of the script on the next slide. So you can just get the images of the bottles and everything.
Great.
It's only 30 seconds long. There we go. And you'll see their logos coming up: Coke, Keurig, Pepsi, American Beverage. And then let's go to the next slide, because I typed in the entire script. It's only 7 sentences long. So I mentioned that there was a lawsuit about the 100% recyclability claim. If you look on the top row to the far right, that sentence is, "We're carefully designing our bottles to be 100% recyclable, including the caps." We know that's nowhere near true right now. There's a bunch of material that's attached to bottles that can't be recycled, and that's why the actual recycling rate is so much lower than the collection rate. The other thing that they're very much doing with this ad is really trying to give the impression that recycling in this country works really well, and that if people just participate, that they'll get every bottle back. I mean, part of the idea of the word every in every bottle back is to make you think that through these efforts, something like 100% is achievable. But even their own projections show that it would only increase the PET recycling rate by 1.3 percentage points. And 1.3 is not every in my mind. Next slide. So that's all I've got. Thank you very much. We've got more information up on our websites. I turn it back over to Kirsty, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Fantastic. And I would like just to mention, and we're not going to really probably have time to get into it, but there was one question, or that was repeated a couple times in the chat, that I'd like to jump into, and that is the idea of refillables and also eliminating plastic entirely. Deposit return systems are really key if we want to have a working refillable, reusable system. And that is how we get to eliminating plastic from our beverage containers entirely. If we can set up a system, a local refill glass system, that's where we want to be. But we can't get there without deposit return systems. We need to get to 90% or so redemption and recycling to be able to do that. So that's kind of an underlying overarching CLF principle that I know others in the chat were concerned about. So that was the first question I wanted to just jump into immediately. Lauren Fernandez, my colleague at CLF, do you have any questions that you pulled from the chat for our wonderful presenters?
I do, and thank you everyone for all your engagement in the chat. We saw lots of great questions and comments in there. So one we want, somebody asked was, when we speak about Coca-Cola, if we're writing for the media or speaking with the media about this problem, how can we connect a company like Coca-Cola to the petroleum industry? Because that's not always the first thing that people connect that to.
Nisha, you want to take that one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's kind of important to highlight that 99% of plastic is from fossil fuels, and yeah, it's kind of propping up the oil industry. There's also a really great report by Carbon Tracker. It's another British organization that actually looks at how, as demand for energy and transport for oil is declining, the oil industry is actually increasingly looking at plastic as a growing share of revenue. So this will actually enable their future. If we don't kind of, phase out plastic, this is what they'll be doing. And it's just, yeah, it kind of fuels the climate crisis as well.
Kirsty, can I jump in on that one too?
Absolutely, Susan.
I think one of the important things that often gets missed is that for beverage companies, up to 50% of the carbon footprint of their product is their packaging. So for the beverage companies to meet their own carbon footprint reduction goals, they have to have really, really high rates of recycling. Mm-hmm. And that's the link. That's the link between the oil in the plastic, it's all connected.
Yeah. Right.
That's great.
They're selling plastic bottles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As much as anything.
If we have time for one more question, I know we're getting to the top of the hour, but somebody asked, what happens to the plastic bottles collected at redemption sites? I think that was a really relevant question. If anyone wants to expand on that.
Well, those are the ones that are most likely to be recycled. When the beverage companies are looking to purchase material to use to make new bottles again, they want that material to be as clean as possible. They want it to be food grade material. They don't want it to be contaminated with maybe having chemicals in it. Like curbside programs will have other bottles like shampoo bottles or Windex bottles that might have had chemicals. And they don't want there to be any possibility that that kind of material is going to be made into their new food grade bottles. So they want to buy the cleanest material. So if bottles go through the redemption process, they're already pre-sorted into PET versus aluminum versus glass through that process. And they are most likely to be made right back into a new bottle or can again.
I wonder if the question was also asking, Susan, about when they said redemption sites. I think it's a little confusing to people, curbside versus other drop-off sites versus redemption too. So a bottle that's in the deposit return system or bottle bill, as Susan just described, is most likely to be recycled. That's true for plastic as well as glass. The curbside system, when they're going to material recovery facilities, MRFs as we call them in the United States, some of the MRFs work really well, but most of them, especially in New England, do not work well. And so some of that plastic does get recycled, but most of it is more likely, as Susan was just saying, it's not as clean. It's more likely to get downcycled to be used for other plastic products, and then meaning like clothes or plastic decking or things like that. So you're not replacing the virgin plastic with recycled plastic. You don't have true circularity. And then the glass in that system, in Massachusetts, none of the curbside glass is being recycled. It's being downcycled to landfill cover or roadbed. It's not being made into glass bottles again. So there is a big difference between sorted bottle bill materials and all mixed together curbside materials and where they end up.
Mm-hmm.
Want to do one more question, Lauren?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. So we'll do one last question. I think there was some conversation in the chat about this, so I'd love to address if any of you could clarify how a program or a tool like how to recycle is part of the problem rather than helping us get to a solution for waste reduction.
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one because our investigation revealed that how to recycle is actually often labeling as recyclable, non-recyclable products. So, for example, plastic 3 to 7 types 3 to 7, they can't really be recycled at scale, and this is the problem.
Yep. In New England, it's number 1, number 2, and number 5 plastics that can possibly be recycled. There's no market for the rest of them. Glass, aluminum, and cardboard and paper. There are a number of items like cartons, for instance, and any mixed media that are not recyclable. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And also, we don't want to be assuming that curbside is working. And remember, we're all paying for curbside, right? Like cities and towns and businesses are paying for curbside. And we're not causing the problem, but we have to clean it up. So that's the other thing I would say about, it's not that we don't want to have curbside recycling or we shouldn't be doing that, but let's be realistic. Why would you ever not make the corporations that are making a tremendous amount of money and profiting hugely from creating this problem, why wouldn't you make them clean it up and deal with it? And that's exactly what deposit return systems or bottle bills do. I did see one question in the chat about Massachusetts and getting involved. The expanded bottle bill, which was sponsored by Representative Decker and Senator Cream, is before the Telecommunications, Utilities, and Energy Committee, and we hope it's going to be favorably reported out by February 2nd. Please contact your legislators and let them know that you want that to happen. Please contact the chairs of that committee, Chairman Roy and Chairman Barrett, and ask them to favorably report it out. If you're in Vermont, same deal. There's a bottle bill expansion that's going to be live this next session there too. So please be aware, and calling your legislators and your local officials to support these things is really important. And then also know that we're hoping there will be a federal bottle bill that will have legs too. But you know, we have to make sure that it's a good bottle bill, and that's true for any deposit return system. We have to make sure that all of the pieces that Nisha explained and that are problems and pitfalls are avoided. We don't want any more delay, distract, or derail. And then all of the good pieces that Susan said are really key for all these systems, we need them to be incorporated, or this is just pretending to recycle and recycling announcements about recycling programs instead of, as Susan said, instead of actually solving the problem. Thank you so much, Nisha and Susan, for your help today and explaining all of this to us. Thank you so much for attending, everybody. And we will share this recording. Please share it far and wide. We want people to understand this. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It was great to be here. Bye.
You were awesome, Nisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting.
Great job, Susan. You were fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for all your help. You were great. And Olivia, too, in the background. Thank you for all your help.